And I never imagined I'd be one of those guys, the ones who come home to find their whole world turned upside down in a single moment. And you see it in movies, you hear stories, but you never think it'll happen to you. That day, I walked to my front door expecting the usual tired wife, maybe dinner on the table, the monotony of life. But what I found, it felt like the air in my lungs froze solid, turning to ice in my chest. The moment I opened the door, I noticed something was off. It was eerily quiet. Grace, my wife, would usually have the TV running or music playing softly in the background. I shrugged it off, assuming she was taking a nap or in one of her introspective moods. We'd been married for 7 years, long enough to know when something was brewing, but still too blind to see the depth of it. I walked into the living room, half expecting to see her reading or scrolling through her phone. But what I saw instead made my stomach flip. Grace was sitting on the couch, but she wasn't alone. Eric Dixon, her boss, the guy I'd met at one too many office parties, was there beside her. They weren't exactly touching, but the way their hands rested so close on the cushion, the silence between them, it told me everything before a single word was spoken. "Frank," Grace started, her voice shaky, like she wasn't sure how to piece the words together. "Eric." I nodded at him, the edges of my vision blurring with red. "What are you doing here?" Eric, always the smooth-talking lawyer, didn't flinch. He met my gaze directly, like he had already rehearsed the lines he was about to drop on me. "Frank, we need to talk." That was the moment it all hit. The long hours Grace had been putting in at work, the late-night texts she claimed were from work emergencies, the distant way she'd been with me for weeks. I'd been too wrapped up in my routine to notice it, or maybe I just didn't want to believe it. But now, standing in the middle of my own living room with this smug asshole sitting on my couch, the pieces fell into place. "So we're going to tell you everything," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't move. I just stood there staring at them both, waiting for the final blow that was surely coming. "We've been seeing each other," Eric said flatly, as if he was telling me the weather outside. "Grace and I, we're in love." "In love?" The words echoed in my head like a sick joke. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, the urge to lunge at him almost unbearable, but I held back. I wasn't going to let him see me lose it. Not yet. Grace took a deep breath and continued. "Frank, we're planning to get a divorce. I'm sorry, but I need to be with Eric. It's better for both of us. We can't go on like this." "Better for both of us?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. How was any of this better for me? "And you, Grace?" I finally asked, my voice coming out colder than I expected. "You think this is the solution? To destroy everything we built. For this?" I pointed at Eric, who still hadn't moved from his seat. I wasn't happy anymore. "Frank," she said, tears brimming in her eyes but never falling. "You have to understand." "Understand? How could I? How does anyone understand being stabbed in the back by the person they trusted most in the world?" "You weren't happy," I echoed, laughing bitterly. "So this is your answer? An affair? With him?" Eric stood up, clearly feeling the tension between us. "Frank, we don't have to make this ugly. Grace and I are just being honest with you. It's better that you know the truth now so we can all move forward." Move forward. That was rich, coming from the guy who was sitting in my living room, ripping my life apart like it was nothing. "Get out." The words left my mouth before I even realized I had said them. "Both of you. Get the hell out of my house." Frank, Grace started to say, but I cut her off with a sharp glare. "I don't want to hear it. Pack your things, Grace. And you," I jabbed a finger at Eric, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "If you're still here when I come back, you'll regret it." Eric gave me a long, measured look before finally nodding. "We'll leave, Frank, but you need to accept that this is happening." I didn't answer him. I just turned around and walked out the door, slamming it behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The fury burned inside me like a wildfire. Grace and Eric's words kept replaying in my head. "We're in love. We're getting a divorce. You have to understand." Understand. They wanted me to calmly accept that my wife was leaving me for her boss. It was pathetic, really. The audacity they had, sitting there like they were doing me a favor by being honest. It was almost laughable. Almost. When I finally pulled into the parking lot of some nameless dive bar on the outskirts of town, I wasn't thinking straight. I just needed to get away, to clear my head before I did something I couldn't take back. I sat down at the bar, ordered a double whiskey, and tried to drown the rage that was simmering just beneath the surface. But the more I drank, the angrier I became. My thoughts were a whirlwind of bitterness, betrayal, and something darker, a thirst for revenge. I could still see the smug look on Eric's face, the way he tried to act like the bigger man, How many times had he been in my house shaking my hand while he was screwing my wife behind my back? After the fourth or fifth drink, I wasn't just angry, I was ready to make them pay. The whiskey had dulled my senses enough to clear away the shock, leaving behind a cold, calculated focus. This wasn't going to end with me just walking away. No, I wasn't that guy. I wasn't going to let them take everything from me without a fight. I threw a few bills on the counter and headed back to my car, a plan already forming in my mind. I knew what I had to do. I'd go back home, confront them one last time, but this time I wouldn't just be walking away. I wanted them to feel what I was feeling. I wanted them to hurt. When I got back to the house, the lights were still on. Part of me hoped Grace had left by now, that she'd be gone and I could just burn the memories down with a bottle of whiskey. But no, she was still there. Of course she was. I stepped inside, my hands shaking slightly as I locked the door behind me. Grace was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen, probably from crying. But my sympathy had dried up the moment I walked in on her with Eric. "You're still here," I said, my voice low, barely controlled. She looked up at me, startled. "Frank, I didn't want to leave things like this." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that made her flinch. "Oh, really? And how exactly did you want to leave things, Grace? With a nice, friendly hug? Maybe a handshake?" "I know you're hurt," she said softly, standing up and walking toward me. "But we can't fix this if we don't talk." "Fix this?" I repeated, incredulous. "There's nothing to fix. You've made your choice. Now you have to live with it." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. But then she straightened up, trying to regain some control. "Frank, please. We didn't want it to end like this." "And yet, here we are," I spat. "It doesn't matter how you wanted it to end. It's over. And he killed at the moment you let him touch you." She started to say something else, but I cut her off, the venom in my voice rising. "Do you love him, Grace? Do you really love him?" She hesitated, just for a second. But that second told me everything I needed to know. She started, but I wasn't going to let her finish. "I don't bother lying to me anymore," I said, stepping closer, my voice low and dangerous. "If you're good at it, I'll give you that. But it's over now. The truth is you're leaving because you think he's better than me. You think you can just walk away and be with him, and everything will be fine." Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. "No, Frank, that's not it at all." "Shut up," I snapped, cutting her off. "Just shut up." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension between us like a live wire ready to snap. When I could feel the anger building inside me, ready to explode. My hands were shaking, and it took everything I had not to lash out, not to make her feel the pain she had caused me. But I didn't. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Grace blinked, confused. "What?" "Eric," I said, slowly enunciating every word. "Where is he?" Her eyes darted toward the stairs, and that was all the answer I needed. Without another word, I turned and started walking up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard her call my name behind me, but I didn't stop. I wasn't going to let her talk me out of this. Not now. I reached the bedroom door and pushed it open. There he was, Eric Dixon, the man who had taken everything from me, sitting on the edge of my bed, his suit jacket draped over the chair like he owned the place. He stood up when he saw me, his face tense, but there was still that smug confidence in his eyes. "Frank, let's just talk about this." "Talk?" I laughed darkly, stepping closer. "You want to talk? After what you've done?" Sir Eric took a step back, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I know this is hard for you, but violence isn't the answer." "Violence?" I repeated, my voice dripping with menace. "You haven't seen violence yet." Before he could react, I lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. His head hit the plaster with a sickening thud, and he groaned in pain, but I didn't care. I wanted him to feel what I was feeling. I wanted him to suffer. "Frank, stop." Grace screamed from the hallway, but her voice barely registered. All I could see was Eric's face, the fear in his eyes as I held him there, my fists clenched. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" I growled, tightening my grip on his collar. "You wanted to take my wife, my life, and just walk away like nothing happened." Eric struggled to break free, but I was stronger. Fueled by the rage boiling inside me, I shoved him harder against the wall, my fists aching to break something, to feel bones shatter beneath them. "You think you can just take everything from me?" I snarled, pulling my arm back, ready to deliver the final blow. But just before I could strike, Grace's voice cut through the fog of anger, louder this time, more desperate. "Frank, don't do this." I froze, my fist hovering in the air. Eric was panting, his eyes wide with fear, and for a brief moment I saw myself. Not the man I was, but the man I was about to become. I let go of him, stepping back. Eric slumped against the wall, gasping for breath. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of Eric's heavy breathing. My knuckles still itched for the punch I didn't throw, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it could snap. Grace was standing in the doorway, wide-eyed and trembling, like she didn't recognize the man she had married anymore. Maybe she didn't. Hell, maybe I didn't even recognize myself. "Frank," she whispered, her voice fragile like glass. This isn't you." I turned to look at her, the woman I had once thought would be with me forever. I stared at her like she was a stranger standing there, trying to look like the victim in all this. The anger in me hadn't faded, it was just changing shape. "You don't get to say that," I said, my voice low and deadly calm. "You lost the right to talk about who I am the moment you opened your legs for him." Grace winced like I'd slapped her, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. Eric, still leaning against the wall, wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, trying to regain some of that smug lawyer composure. "I think you should leave, Frank," he muttered, his voice shaky but trying to hold some authority. "Well, we can settle this like adults." Adults? The nerve of this guy. He had the gall to think he could stand in my house, screw my wife, and then lecture me on being an adult. I laughed cold and humorless before stepping closer to him again. He flinched, his body pressing deeper into the wall, like he was trying to melt into it, but I stopped myself from reaching for him. So instead, I let the silence stretch, knowing it would terrify him more than anything else. "I should leave?" I asked, taking a step back, letting the words sink in. "No, Eric." "What, the one who should leave? But before you go," I turned to Grace, narrowing my eyes. "Do you need to make a choice right now?" She looked at me, tears pooling in her eyes, her lips trembling as if she had no idea what I was about to say. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've got one shot to fix this, Grace. Either you walk out of here with him," I pointed to Eric, who was looking between us, visibly panicked, "or you end this right now and we figure out how to move forward." Grace's lips parted in shock, but I wasn't done. "But if you leave with him," I continued, my voice steady, "don't ever expect to see me again. You and I, we're over, no second chances, no discussions, just over." So Eric tried to protest, taking a step forward. "Frank, come on, you can't put this on her like that. She deserves the freedom to make her own choice." I shot him a glare that could have burned a hole through his skull. "Shut up. This isn't about you. This is between me and my wife, or at least she used to be." I turned back to Grace, waiting for her answer. My heart was pounding, and as much as I wanted to walk away and never look back, a part of me, some foolish part, still hoped she would choose me. And the anger was still there, the betrayal still searing deep inside, but I needed to hear her say she regretted it, that she was sorry, that she wanted me. The silence stretched on forever as she stood there, torn between her past and the future she thought she wanted. I watched her eyes flicker to Eric, then back to me. The hesitation in her gaze was killing me. "Frank," she finally whispered, her voice cracking, "I never meant to hurt you." I clenched my fists, my teeth grinding together. "That's not what I'm asking, Grace. I'm asking you to choose, him or me, now." Her tears started falling then, and she sobbed quietly, covering her mouth with her hand as she shook her head. I don't know. I'm so sorry." That was it. That was all I needed to hear. She didn't know. She couldn't choose. In that instant, everything inside me shattered, the hope I'd been clinging to crumbling into dust. But without a word, I turned on my heel and started walking back downstairs. I could hear Grace calling after me. Her footsteps hurried behind me as she followed. "Frank, wait, please just wait," she cried, her voice thick with desperation. But I was done waiting, done listening, done being the fool in this twisted game. I reached the living room, grabbed my jacket, and stormed toward the door. Grace caught up to me, grabbing my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "Please don't leave like this. We can talk about it. We can fix this." I stopped and looked down at her, my heart hardening with each passing second. The woman I had loved, the one I'd promised my life to, was standing in front of me, begging me to stay after she had just torn my soul apart. And the worst part, she wasn't even sure if she wanted me anymore. "I gave you a chance, Grace," I said quietly. "You couldn't even make a choice." Her grip tightened, her eyes pleading with me. "I don't want to lose you." "You already have." The words felt final, and I meant them. Her grip loosened, and I turned away, opening the door. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it was nothing compared to the numbness that had settled inside me. I slammed the door behind me, drowning out her sobs as I walked away from the life I thought I had. Every step I took felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind, but I knew there was no going back. And I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than being in that house with her and that man. Eric. The name made my blood boil all over again, but I pushed the anger down. There would be time for that later. And right now, I just needed to breathe. I reached my car and paused for a moment, looking back at the house. The lights were still on, and I could imagine Grace inside crying, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I didn't care. Not anymore. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. Let her have him, I thought bitterly. Let them both rot in the mess they made. The next few days passed in a blur. I didn't go back home. I didn't call Grace. I didn't want to face the wreckage of what my life had been. So instead, I found a cheap hotel on the other side of town and holed up there, nursing a bottle of whiskey and the smoldering hatred inside me. But I wasn't wallowing in self-pity. No, I was planning. Grace had chosen her path, even if she hadn't had the guts to admit it. She'd fallen for her boss, Eric, the arrogant prick, who thought he could waltz into my life and take everything from me. But he was wrong. He didn't know who he was messing with. I wasn't going to be some sad, heartbroken husband who disappeared quietly into the night. And I was going to make them both regret every moment they spent together. My first move was simple. I called in a favor from a friend who worked in IT. It didn't take long for him to dig up Eric's personal email, his phone records, and every bit of financial dirt I could use against him. Turns out, the slick lawyer had more skeletons in his closet than just his affair with Grace. Embezzlement from his firm, shady side deals with clients, things that could ruin a man's career if they ever saw the light of day. I smiled to myself as I pored over the files, imagining Eric's smug face when he realized his whole life was about to come crashing down. But I wasn't done yet. Grace had always been terrible with money. I'd been the one handling our finances, making sure the bills were paid, the savings were in order. She didn't have a clue how deep I had my hands in everything. With a few clicks, I drained our joint accounts, moving the money into a personal account she had no access to. She wouldn't notice right away she was too caught up in her new life with Eric. But when she did, it would hit her hard. The freedom she thought she was gaining, it was about to come at a price. I wasn't going to stop there. This wasn't just about money. I wanted them to feel the same kind of helplessness and pain that I had felt when I walked in on them. I wanted them to suffer. I spent the next few days carefully crafting the perfect storm. Eric had a wife, a beautiful, doting woman I'd met at office parties, smiling through every social gathering. She had no idea what her husband had been up to, no idea that her entire marriage was built on lies. That was about to change. I found her number in Eric's phone records. Her name was Sarah. I called her one afternoon, rehearsing the words in my head as the phone rang. Hello? Her voice was sweet, almost cheerful. It made what I was about to say that much more satisfying. Sarah, this is Frank. We met a few times at some of the firm's parties. I'm Grace's husband. There was a pause on the line and I could hear the confusion in her voice when she answered. No, yes, Frank. Is everything okay? I took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of guilt, but I crushed it down. I couldn't afford guilt now. No, Sarah. Everything's not okay. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Eric, your husband, he's been having an affair with my wife. D. Silence. Then, the sharp intake of breath. What? I'm so sorry, I continued, letting my voice soften just enough to sound sincere. I thought you deserved to know. I walked in on them together a few days ago. With the line stayed quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear her mind racing, trying to process what I had just said. Then, a shaky exhale. I don't understand. You will, I said quietly. Check his phone. Check his messages. You'll see. I hung up before she could respond, tossing the phone onto the bed and leaning back in my chair. That was step one. Let Eric deal with the fallout at home. Let him feel the panic as his perfect little life slipped through his fingers. Next, I turned my attention back to Grace. She was going to feel this too. Every choice she made was going to haunt her, and I wasn't going to stop until she knew what she had lost. It didn't take long for things to start crumbling. Within days, I saw the first signs of my plan working. Grace called me several times. At first, I ignored the calls, but when the voicemail started coming in, I listened. The desperation in her voice was like music to my ears. Frank, I don't know what's going on. The bank says there's no money in our account. When I thought we had savings, where are you? We need to talk. And I smirked, listening to her plead with me, but I didn't call back, let her sweat it out. A few days later, I got a text from a mutual friend. "Did you hear? Eric's wife left him." Total meltdown. I couldn't help but laugh. Everything was falling apart for them. Sarah must have confronted him. And now Eric was dealing with the mess I'd unleashed on his life. Good. He deserved every bit of it. But the best part? I wasn't done yet. I made sure to keep tabs on them, using my friends' connections to track their every move. Eric was trying to fix things, of course running back and forth between his law firm and his crumbling marriage, trying to juggle the fallout. Grace, on the other hand, was spiraling. I heard she'd moved out of the house, probably thinking she could run to Eric for comfort. But Eric was in no position to save her. Watched it all from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike again. So it was a Friday night when I finally decided to return home. The house was empty, just as I expected. Grace had left. There was no trace of her anywhere, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of peace. I walked through the quiet rooms, thinking about everything we had once shared, but it didn't hurt anymore. Not like it used to. I poured myself a drink and sat down in the living room, staring out the window at the darkening sky. I had done it. I had destroyed them both. Grace was gone, Eric's life was in shambles, and I was free. Free to move on, free to rebuild. As I sat there, sipping my drink, I realized that this was the closure I needed. Not the messy, emotional breakdown I thought I'd have, but a cold, calculated end to the story. I didn't need Grace anymore. I didn't need to cling to the life we once had. I was going to be okay. Better than okay, actually. I was going to start over on my terms. Maybe one day I'd meet someone else. Maybe I wouldn't. But for now, I had won, and that was all that mattered.